Thank you, Gordon, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and to hear about some of the risks and opportunities as we think about developing secure and ethical supply chains for these critical materials. I'm going to talk to you today about unfree labour or forced labour and what that means in the global mining context and in particular for critical materials. But before I start, I'd like to share some images and stories with you from humanitarian photographer Lisa Christine. These boys and men are enslaved in illegal gold mining in Ghana. Most come from the north, hoping to strike it rich, working at the legal mines. When they can't get a job, they borrow money at extortionate interest rates or join teams of slaves known as gangs. The gangs work in areas abandoned by the big companies. They can only sell their gold to the moneylender at a price he sets. They are trapped by illegal, fictitious debt and often hunted by local police for trespassing. Many talk about wanting to escape. Some believe they will become rich if they work just a little longer and harder. Underground, there's always a risk of a cave-in. Above ground, the loose earth gives way beneath their feet. Ibiku and his friends have been rescued and are in a shelter. Most are making remarkable recoveries, but some of them, like Ibiku, have visible scars on their heads where their master has hit them. They have even deeper hidden scars. Their journey to health will be longer. These stories illustrate the human impact of modern slavery. Similar conditions surrounding the artisanal mining of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo mean that up to 40,000 children are estimated to be working in modern slavery in those mines today. I'd like to connect some of these stories, not just with the global mining industry or with conflict minerals, but with what this really means for critical materials and what we're here to talk about today. You've heard the speakers before me discuss the opportunities for Australia and its partners as we develop these supply chains. And I'd like us all to turn our minds for a moment and to think about what that opportunity means in terms of leverage. What leverage do we have as businesses and governments to influence the labour standards in these supply chains? I don't think for a moment that any business or government wants those forms of exploitation in their supply chains. I don't believe that consumers or investors want to buy or invest in products that are based on that. And so how do we come together through models of regional cooperation to lift those standards and to ensure that that exploitation isn't occurring? Not just the opportunity for Australia as we perhaps start to develop our processing capability and downstream production using critical materials, but also upstream. Where are we sourcing these materials from and what influence do we have to lift the standards there? So I'm a corporate lawyer by trade. I understand how businesses and governments think about risk. And I think in this context, we really need to shift our thinking from risks to business to risks to people. So what is unfree labour and what does it look like in the global mining context? Unfree labour sits in a spectrum. At the one end, you have fair and decent work. In the middle, you might have different forms of exploitation, whether it be underpayment of wages, perhaps unsafe working conditions, or excessive hours. At the other end, you have forced labour, or a form of modern slavery. Here, freedom is taken away by threats, violence, coercion, abuse of power, and deception. The net result is that a person cannot refuse or leave the situation, even though that restraint may not be physical. Globally, there's 40.3 million people living in some form of modern slavery today. 25 million of those are living in forced labour. These numbers come from estimates, the global estimates of modern slavery that Walk Free publishes together with the International Labour Organization. You can see from this slide that modern slavery occurs not just in war-torn countries in Africa and not just in the conflict minerals context. There's huge risks in the construction sector, garment sector, shipping and transport. Each of these is closely connected to mining operations and supply chains. Many of these industries use recruitment agents to provide staff. Migrant workers are promised jobs overseas, only to be told on arrival that they owe the recruitment agent a debt of $8,000 for the recruitment fee, and that it will take them 2 years of working with little or no pay to pay that back. In the meantime, they're trapped working in horrific conditions and threatened with violence if they leave. So what are companies' legal obligations and what else is driving them to act? You can see from this slide that there's increasing awareness from the press, civil society, and investors. We've also seen new laws coming in, like the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, which requires companies to conduct due diligence and report on the actions that they're taking to combat forced labour or modern slavery in their supply chain. The UK and California both have similar supply chain transparency laws, and the US and EU have specific laws on conflict minerals, requiring disclosures by companies using tin, tungsten, tantalum and gold, or the 3TG. If I could share some advice here around these supply chain transparency laws, it would be perhaps don't listen to your lawyers too closely. I think that the spirit of this legislation is really transparency, and that makes lawyers very nervous. The leading companies in this space are leaning towards radical transparency. They're sharing where their suppliers are, where those factories are located, and where that processing is occurring. This involves disclosing real risk and even instances of exploitation or slavery. It's a brave move and understandably makes many lawyers very nervous. Beyond the laws and regulatory framework, there's a very strong business case for taking action. Data is emerging which shows us that companies with better labour practices actually perform better. This makes sense. Workers who are free and safe are likely to be more productive. Consumers and investors are also demanding more transparency. Ethics is driving their decision-making. ESG-rated capital topped $30 trillion globally in 2018. This trend is likely to continue, and lagging companies will lose out on capital if they can't show that they've addressed the risk of forced labour in their supply chains. So what should companies do? At a very high level, companies need to map their operations and supply chain, assess the salient human rights risks, including forced labour, and then decide how to address those risks. This is going to look different depending on where those risks are in your supply chain and what leverage you have. I think Maeda-san, who spoke before me, gave a very good example of using leverage in the context of regional cooperation and what that looks like when you want to bring your partners along with you to lift standards. In the example I gave before with recruitment fees, asking your suppliers how they recruit staff and whether workers are required to pay fees may uncover unscrupulous practices. But in other cases, more complex due diligence and audits will be required. For critical materials, we've heard traceability is a real challenge. We're starting to see the use of new technologies such as blockchain that identify where minerals have come from and attest to whether they were ethically sourced. For more guidance, I'd recommend looking at the Responsible Minerals Initiative, which has a suite of tools and resources that can help implement some of these due diligence frameworks that I've mentioned today, including the OECD guidelines on conflict minerals. The Australian government also has some very good guidance on reporting and compliance with Australia's Modern Slavery Act. So we've heard today a lot about risks and opportunities. Risks to countries, industries and business when the supply of critical materials are disrupted. And opportunities for Australia and its partners to develop more secure and sustainable supply chains. We simply cannot realise that opportunity without addressing the risks to people. and ultimately eradicating forced labour from these supply chains. It will take time, true leadership and partnerships between business, civil society and government to change, but it can be done. Thank you.